So here's the next part of the American Revolution. We're discussing Valley Forge. Now, Washington's army is wintering at Valley Forge near Philadelphia, 1777 to 1778. It is a time of really great suffering. An estimated 12,000 patriots, including some as young as 12 years old, accompanied by their mothers, lack shoes and blankets. They're hungry. The makeshift log and mud huts offer little protection. By February of 1778, some 7,000 troops are too ill for duty. More than 2,500 die at Valley Forge. 1,000 desert them. Several hundred officers resign or left before winter's end. Washington sent urgent messages to Congress, warning that if fresh food and supplies were not provided, the army would be forced to starve, dissolve, or disperse. They're very lucky that General Howe was happy to ride out the winter in Philadelphia. For the Americans, there was little comfort. Washington actually sends troops, in desperation, to New Jersey, Delaware, and the eastern shore of Maryland to confiscate different things from other people. They confiscate things like horses, cattle, and hogs in exchange for receipts, IOUs, promising future payment from the army. They were starving to death, and they were dying. It was not good. Washington did do something well, though. He believed in inoculation, so he had the troops inoculated from smallpox. It was very rampant among the American armies. So by 1777, Washington had come to dread smallpox. On any given day, a fourth of American troops were deemed unfit for duty, usually because of it. The threat was so great that Washington actually ordered a mass inoculation of the entire army, and in the end it does pay off. The successful inoculation was one of Washington's greatest strategic accomplishments. By spring, recruits began arriving to claim the bonuses that Congress promised. They cobbled together some 9,000 regular troops. So this is back in the day. You see, the inoculation actually worked for them, which was great because they desperately needed it. So, when the Battle of Saratoga convinced the French to recognize American independence and form a military alliance, it changes the course of the war by opening a door to a badly needed military support. The French supplied the United States with gunpowder and money, as well as soldiers and naval forces that proved decisive in the defeat of Great Britain. French also contributed military leaders, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who arrived in America in 1777 as a volunteer and served as Washington's aide-de-camp. So the war quickly became more difficult for the British, who sought to fight the rebels in North America as well as the French in the Caribbean. Following France's lead, Spain joins the war against Great Britain in 1779, although it did not recognize American independence until 1783. The Dutch Republic also began to support the American revolutionaries and signed a treaty of commerce with the United States in 1782. So, despite Britain's efforts to isolate New England in 1777, it failed. In June of 1778, the occupying British force in Philadelphia evacuated and returned to New York City in order to better defend the city. And the British then turned their attentions to the southern colonies. Now, June 28, 1778, General Washington and his subordinate General Lee attacked a rearguard element of General Sir Henry's British army. The American army outnumbered its foe 2-1 and had undergone extensive training in the art of war during that winter at Valley Forge. Lee lacks confidence in the ability of the Continental soldiers under his command. So Lee actually succeeds the initiative to his British counterpart, General Cornwallis, who commanded the rear element of Clinton's army. began as a promising opportunity devolved into a potential disaster. As Washington approached the fighting, he encountered panic-stricken troops fleeing the enemy. Enraged, he galloped ahead. In angry confrontation filled with battle, Washington actually removes Lee from command. So Washington continued the assault along the British. The command general's delaying action gave time for the rest of the Continental Army to come up and join the battle. So Washington replaced him with General Nathan Greene's division on the right and the division of William Alexander Lloyd Sterling on the left. Lee's men were turned over to the Marquis de Lafayette, who kept the troops in reserve. An American counterattack on the British right forced the Redcoats to fall back and recognize. Cornwallis then led his men in an attack on Greene's division. Supported by artillery, Greene's men stiffened their line and repulsed Cornwallis and his troops. The fighting seesaw back and forth under the brutal June. They fought back and forth under the June sun for several hours. So by 6 p.m., however, the British had had enough. While Wayne wanted to press back, Washington demurred, believing that his men were beat out. The British did not give Washington a chance to renew the fight in the morning. They slipped away under the undercover of darkness and continued their withdrawal to New York. So by 1778, the war had turned into a stalemate. Although some in Britain, including Prime Minister Lord North, wanted peace, King George III demanded that the colony be brought to obedience. To break the deadlock, the British revised their strategy and turned their attention to the southern colonies, where they could expect support from loyalists. Southern colonies soon become the center of the fighting, and the southern strategy brought the British success at first, but thanks to the leadership of George Washington and General Nathan Greene and the crushing assistance of French forces, the Continental Army defeated the British, eventually at Yorktown. So, Greene is wearing them down in a series of small battles. Nathaniel Greene was a Rhode Island Quaker who had abandoned pacifism for the war effort and became Washington's ablest commander. The British architect of the war strategy was Lord George Germain. He believed Britain would gain the upper hand with the support of loyalists, slaves, and Indian allies in the South. And indeed, the Southern strategy initially achieved with great success. The British began their Southern campaign by capturing Savannah, the capital of Georgia, in December of 1778. In Georgia, they found support from thousands of slaves who ran to the British side to escape their bondage. As the British regained political control in Georgia, they forced the inhabitants to swear allegiance to the king and formed 20 loyalist regiments. The Continental Congress had suggested that slaves be given freedom if they joined the Patriot Army against the British, but revolutionaries in Georgia and South Carolina refused to consider this proposal. Once again, the revolution served to further the divisions over race and slavery. Now, after the taking of Georgia, the British turned their attentions to South Carolina. Before the Revolution, South Carolina had been starkly divided between the backcountry and the coastal regions. Waves of violence racked the backcountry from the late 1770s into the 1780s. The Revolution provided an opportunity for residents to fight over their local regiments and antagonisms with motorist consequences. So, in April of 1780, a British force of 8,000 soldiers besieged American forces in Charleston. After 6 weeks of the siege of Charleston, the British do triumph. The disaster at Charleston led the Continental Congress to change leadership by placing General Horatio Gates in charge of American forces in the South. However, General Gates fared no better than General Lincoln. At the Battle of Camden, South Carolina in August of 1780, Cornwallis forced General Gates to retreat into North Carolina. Camden was one of the worst disasters suffered by American armies during the entire Revolutionary War. So Congress again changed military leaders, and this time they placed General Nathanael Greene in command in December of 1780. As the British had hoped, large numbers of loyalists helped ensure the success of the Southern strategy, and thousands of slaves arrived to aid Cornwallis's army. However, the war turned in the Americans' favor in 1781. See, General Greene realized that to defeat Cornwallis, he didn't have to win a single battle. So long as he remained in the field, he could continue to destroy isolated British forces. So Greene therefore made a strategic decision to divide his own troops to wage war, and it worked. American forces under General Daniel Morgan decisively beat the British at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. General Cornwallis now abandoned his strategy of defeating the backcountry rebels in South Carolina because of this. Now, during 1780, the Revolutionary War became a contest of endurance. The Americans had the advantage in time, men, and supplies. They knew they could outlast the British as long as they avoided a catastrophic defeat. Now, in the summer of 1781, Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia. He expected the Royal Navy to transport his army to New York, where he thought he would join General Sir Henry Clinton. Yorktown was a tobacco port on a peninsula, and Cornwallis believed the British Navy would be able to keep the coast clear of rebel ships. Sensing an opportunity, a combined French and American force of 16,000 men swarmed the peninsula in September of 1781. Washington raced south with his forces and now disciplined army, as did Lafayette and their French troops. So the French army arrives, and the Admiral de Grasse sailed his naval force into Chesapeake Bay. It prevents Lord Cornwallis from taking a seaward escape route. In October of 1781, the American forces began the Battle of Yorktown, and after the siege that lasted 8 days, Cornwallis he gave up. Tradition says during the surrender of his troops, the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," a song that befitted the Empire's unexpected reversal of fortune. So the British defeat at Yorktown made the outcome of the war all but certain. In the light of American victory, the Parliament of Great Britain voted to end the military operations against the rebels and began peace negotiations. Support of the war effort had come to an end. The British military forces began to evacuate the former American colonies in 1782. The hostilities were over. Washington resigned as commander-in-chief and returned to his home in Virginia. Now, early in 1782, the British contacted Benjamin Franklin in Paris to ask if the Americans would be willing to sign a peace treaty without involving the French. Franklin replied the United States had no intention of deserting its noble French ally to sign a treaty with an unjust and cruel enemy. So they did vote eventually to begin negotiations. So France let Franklin know it was willing to let the United States to negotiate on its own. So the Continental Congress named 3 men to go: John Adams, representing the U.S. and the Netherlands; John Jay, minister to Spain; and Franklin, who was already in France. It dragged on for months. When they signed the Treaty of Paris, so Great Britain recognized the independence of the 13 colonies and agreed that the Mississippi River was America's western boundary, thereby more than doubling the territory of the new nation. The treaty's unclear reference to American northern and southern borders would be a source of dispute for years. Florida, as it turned out, would pass back to Spain. In winning the war, the America had acquired a robust sense of their own power and the awareness of limitations of British power. Most important, Americans had earned their legitimate right to decide their own future. Whatever the failing and hypocrisies of the Revolution, it served to connect, it severed America's connection with the monarchical rule and provided the catalyst for the creation of represented democracy.